The night air sliced through the stillness with an icy edge, sharp and unyielding, as if it carried a warning of its own. "Get out of the car now," the officer's voice lashed out, cutting through the frigid darkness like a whip cracking against bare skin. It wasn't a request, it was a command, delivered with a venom that made the woman behind the wheel flinch inwardly, though her face remained a mask of practiced calm. Her hands stayed glued to the steering wheel, fingers curled tightly around the worn leather, just as she'd been taught in those tense, whispered lessons from her father years ago. Keep your hands where they can see them. Don't give them a reason. She took a slow breath, steadying herself against the rising tide of unease that churned in her chest, and ventured cautiously, "Officer, may I know why I'm being stopped?" The response came fast and brutal, like a slap across the face. "You ask too many questions," he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. His hand hovered near the holster strapped to his hip, fingers twitching as if itching for an excuse to draw the weapon. The faint glint of moonlight off the metal sent a shiver down her spine. "License and registration. Now." His words were a barked order, leaving no room for hesitation. She complied, her movements deliberate and controlled, though her hands betrayed her with a slight tremble as she reached for the glove compartment. The papers rustled softly as she handed them over, her mind racing to make sense of the moment. "It's just a traffic stop," she told herself, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. "Just another night where I don't belong in their eyes." She'd been through this dance before, profiled, questioned, judged, for no reason beyond the color of her skin and the audacity to drive through a part of town that didn't welcome her kind. She braced herself for the usual script. A condescending lecture, maybe a thinly veiled insult. But the air felt different tonight, heavier, charged with something she couldn't yet name. The officer snatched the documents from her grasp, his eyes flicking over her ID with a cursory glance before locking onto her face. A smirk twisted his lips, slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the strike. "What are you doing out here this late?" he drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "This isn't your kind of neighborhood." The words landed like a punch, each syllable laced with an unspoken accusation. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing her voice to remain even. "I was just driving home," she replied, her tone measured despite the frantic pounding of her heart. She willed herself to stay calm, to keep this from spiraling into something worse. Escalation wasn't an option, not here, not with him. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked again, his voice rising with a sudden ferocity that made her stomach drop. She hesitated, her mind scrambling for footing. "Is there a problem?" she asked, clinging to composure as if it were armor. His eyes narrowed, glinting with a cold, dangerous light. "Yeah, there's a problem," he sneered, stepping closer to the car. "I don't like your attitude. And I don't like people like you thinking they can do whatever they want around here." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air like a guillotine blade, sharp and loaded with meaning. Her breath caught, a flicker of defiance sparking in her chest. "People like me," she echoed, her voice steady but daring him to say it outright, to peel back the mask and reveal the ugliness beneath. He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he lunged forward, yanking the car door open with a force that made the hinges groan. "What are you doing?" she cried, her calm shattering as shock flooded her system. Her voice rose, raw and unfiltered, as he seized her arm in a bruising grip and dragged her from the driver's seat. The cold pavement bit into her shoes as she stumbled, her mind spinning in disbelief. "Teaching you a lesson," he muttered under his breath, the words barely audible but heavy with menace. Her pulse thundered in her ears as he pulled her away from the safety of her car, her instinct screaming that this was no ordinary stop. This wasn't protocol. This was something darker. Something unhinged. He didn't lead her to his squad car, didn't call for backup or read her rights. Instead, he marched her down a shadowed path, away from the road, toward the desolate stretch of railroad tracks that snaked behind the town's industrial sprawl. The air grew thick with the acrid tang of rust and oil, a metallic stench that clung to her throat with every ragged breath. In the distance, the low hum of an approaching train vibrated through the ground, a faint rumble that grew steadily louder. More ominous. Her shoes crunched against gravel as she struggled to keep pace, his grip on her arm unrelenting. "Officer, is this necessary?" she demanded. Her voice firm despite the tremor of fear threading through it. "You're crossing a line." She searched his face for a shred of reason, but found only a wall of arrogance staring back. "You think you can talk back to me?" he shot back, his fingers tightening until she winced. "You think your fancy words are going to save you?" He stopped abruptly near the tracks, his eyes gleaming with a twisted blend of pride and malice under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. The rail stretched out before them, cold and unforgiving, glinting faintly in the moonlight. "You see this?" he said, jabbing a finger toward the steel. "This is where you learn your place." Her heart lurched as the words sank in, a sickening realization dawning. "What are you doing?" she demanded, pulling against his hold with renewed desperation. "Shut up," he growled, his voice a low snarl as he yanked a coil of rope from his belt. The rough fibers scraped against his palm as he brandished it, his intent unmistakable. "You want to act tough? Let's see how tough you are when a train's bearing down on you." Her breath hitched. A gasp trapped in her throat as he forced her down onto the gravel beside the tracks. The cold steel pressed against her legs, sending a jolt of panic through her veins. He moved with terrifying efficiency, binding her hands together with the rope, the knots tight and unyielding. "This is insane," she shouted, her voice echoing into the empty night, swallowed by the vastness around them. "You can't do this." "I can do whatever I want," he sneered, stepping back to survey his handiwork with a sick satisfaction. "And no one's going to believe you anyway. A black woman claiming a cop did this? Please. They'll think you're delusional." His smug grin widened as he watched her, illuminated by the faint, eerie glow of the train's approaching lights. The ground beneath her trembled, the horn blaring in the distance, a piercing wail that drowned out the thudding of her heart. She felt the vibrations intensify, the steel rails humming with the promise of destruction. Fear clawed at her, raw and primal, but she refused to break. She wouldn't beg. Wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze, her eyes burning with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that grated against the night. "Is that so? Let's see if you're still talking big when the train gets here." The horn blared again, closer now, the ground shaking with the weight of the oncoming beast. But then, something shifted. She smiled, not a smile of surrender, but something deeper, something that sent a flicker of unease rippling across his face. "What the hell are you smiling at?" he barked, stepping closer, his bravado faltering for the first time. "You really have no idea who I am, do you?" she said, her voice calm, almost playful, laced with a confidence that made his brow furrow. Confusion flashed in his eyes, a crack in the armor of his arrogance. Doubt crept in, slow and insidious, gnawing at the edges of his certainty. The train's light blazed into view, its roar deafening as it barreled closer, casting long shadows across the tracks. He took an instinctive step back, suddenly aware of how dangerously close they stood to the edge. "Untie me," she commanded, her tone sharp and unyielding. "Or I promise you'll regret this." He froze, caught between the intoxicating rush of power and a growing, unshakable dread. The train's rumble filled the air, its light blinding, its horn a relentless scream. Her gaze never wavered, steady and piercing, as if she held a secret that could unravel him entirely. What happened next would send shockwaves through the town, leaving the police department reeling, the community ablaze with demands for justice, and a nation grappling with the raw, unfiltered truth of what had transpired. Because this woman wasn't just anyone. And the consequences of his actions, his abuse of power, his blind arrogance, were about to crash down on him with a force he could never have imagined. The officer, Dan Grayson, was a man forged in the crucible of Montrose, a small Midwestern town where the hum of factories and the haze of smokestacks defined the rhythm of life. Tall and imposing, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that glinted like ice, he embodied the kind of authority that demanded obedience. To his colleagues at the precinct, he was a rock, unflinching, dependable, the one they called when trouble brewed. But trouble, in Dan's world, had a face, a color, a status, and he wielded his badge like a scepter, meting out his own warped version of justice. He thrived on control, reveled in the fear he inspired, and wore his biases like a second skin, so ingrained they felt like gospel. To him, power wasn't just a tool, it was a right. The woman, Maya Brooks, was a force of a different kind. Born amid the chaos and vibrancy of Chicago, she carried a fire that Montrose could never contain. At 32, she was an FBI investigator, a hunter of corruption with a mind as sharp as a blade and a spirit that refused to bend. She'd faced down worse than Dan Grayson, crooked officials, ruthless cartels, but nothing had prepared her for the raw, visceral hatred she felt radiating from him now. As he tied her to the tracks, her thoughts churned, not with panic, but with a cold, calculating clarity. She knew men like him, knew their weaknesses, their insecurities, and she'd spent years turning the tables on those who underestimated her. The train bore down, a steel beast roaring through the night, and in that moment, the lesson crystallized for both of them. For Dan, it was a reckoning, a brutal reminder that power, when abused, invites its own downfall. For Maya, it was a testament to resilience, to the strength that comes from knowing who you are when the world tries to strip it away. Justice wasn't just a concept here, it was a force. Alive and unyielding, and its consequences would echo far beyond this lonely stretch of tracks. What Maya did next, how she turned the hunter into the hunted, would leave Montrose in ruins. A cautionary tale etched in the annals of a town that thought it knew the meaning of order. The air in Montrose carried a subtle weight, a stillness that clung to the smaller streets and whispered through the shadows of its modest buildings. Maya moved through this quiet town with a steady grace, her dark skin catching the faint glow of streetlights, her tightly coiled hair swaying lightly with each step, a testament to a pride she wore like armor. To some, that pride edged too close to defiance, a silent challenge they didn't know how to read. But Maya had stopped caring about their misjudgments long ago. She'd learned early that respect wasn't a gift handed out freely, it was a presence you carved out for yourself, a force you demanded through sheer will. And in Montrose, she was determined to wield that force, though no one yet knew why. She hadn't come to this place by accident. Montrose wasn't just another dot on the map, it was a town under a microscope. Its police department tangled in a web of federal scrutiny. Complaints had piled up like storm clouds, civil rights violations, racial profiling, excessive force, accusations that painted a picture of something rotten beneath the surface. The evidence wasn't just whispers, it was a trail, jagged and undeniable, pointing to a system fraying at the edges. Among the names tangled in the mess, one stood out, sharp and insistent, Sergeant Dan Grayson. He wasn't the only one under the lens. But his name surfaced too often to ignore, a thread Maya had been tasked to pull. Her mission was clear: watch, listen, document. Unearth the truth buried beneath the polished badges and official reports. For now, though, she was a ghost in Montrose, a stranger slipping into its rhythm, her purpose hidden behind a calm exterior. Weeks had passed since she'd settled into the town, renting a modest apartment on its quieter fringes, a place where the hum of life felt muted, where she could think. She'd made a habit of lingering at the local diner, a weathered spot with chipped tables and the constant clink of coffee mugs. It wasn't just the greasy fries or the too strong coffee that drew her. It was the voices. Snippets of conversation floated around her, grumbled complaints about the weather, small-town gossip, and, if she listened closely, hints of unease about the police. The townsfolk were polite enough, their smiles tight and their words clipped, but there was a wariness in their eyes when they glanced her way. She felt it like a current beneath the surface. A ripple of suspicion that followed her wherever she went. They didn't know her, didn't trust her, and maybe they sensed she wasn't just passing through. She jotted it all down in her notebook later. Each observation a fragment of a puzzle she was piecing together, a map to something larger. One evening, as the sun sank low, bathing Montrose in a wash of amber and slate, Maya finished her meal at the diner. The sky felt heavy, pressing down on the town as she stepped outside, her boots tapping a soft rhythm against the cracked pavement. Her car, a plain sedan, chosen for its anonymity, waited a few blocks away, and the streets stretched out empty before her. She walked with purpose, her mind already sifting through the day's notes, planning how she'd organize them when she got home. The cool air brushed her skin, and she pulled her jacket tighter, lost in thought. Across town, Dan Grayson was restless. The night had been slow. Too quiet for his liking, and it gnawed at him. He thrived on the rush, the moments when he could flex his authority, feel the world bend under his command. Cruising the streets in his patrol car, his eyes scanned for anything to break the monotony. Then he spotted it, Maya's car, unfamiliar in a town where every license plate was a known quantity. His curiosity sharpened into something darker. He didn't recognize the vehicle, and in Montrose, that was enough to set him on edge. He eased his cruiser into a discreet tail, watching as the sedan rolled through the dim streets, its driver oblivious to his presence. When Maya paused at a red light, he made his move, flicking on his siren with a flick of his wrist, the sharp wail cutting through the silence. In her rearview mirror, Maya saw the flashing lights, and a faint twist of unease coiled in her stomach. She hadn't sped, hadn't swerved, hadn't given him a reason, but she knew that didn't always matter. Her hands stayed steady on the wheel, visible, as she waited, her breath even but her mind racing. Dan approached. His boots heavy on the asphalt, his silhouette looming in her side mirror. The exchange started simply, license, registration, the routine script. His voice was flat at first, professional. But it didn't stay that way. "What are you doing out here this late?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed her documents, searching for something to latch onto. "Just heading home," she answered, her tone smooth, measured, a wall he couldn't breach. But Dan pressed harder. "This isn't your part of town," he said, his words sharp, less a question than a jab. Maya's brow lifted slightly, a flicker of defiance she didn't bother to hide, but she held her silence, refusing to rise to his bait. "Is there a reason you stopped me, officer?" she asked instead. Her voice steady, cutting through his game. Dan didn't answer. He just stared, his gaze cold, sizing her up. Something about her unnerved him, her calm, her poise. The way she didn't flinch under his scrutiny. It felt like a challenge, though he couldn't pin down why. His questions sharpened, his tone grew rougher. And the air between them thickened with tension. Maya tried to defuse it, offering brief, careful responses, but he wasn't listening. He didn't want explanations, he wanted submission. When he ordered her out of the car, his voice was a low growl, impatience bleeding through. Maya hesitated, her instinct screaming that this was no ordinary stop, that something darker was at play. But she complied, stepping into the night air, her hands still visible, her heart pounding beneath her calm facade. Dan's grip on her arm was tight as he pulled her away from the car, his fingers digging into her skin. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice firm despite the frustration simmering inside her. He didn't answer, just muttered under his breath. "You want to play tough? Let's see how tough you are." In the distance, a train horn wailed, a mournful sound that sent a shiver down her spine, one she couldn't blame on the chill. He led her toward the tracks, and her mind spun, piecing together his intent. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It was personal, a raw display of power, and Dan reveled in it. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she was here, but to him, she was an outsider who needed to be taught a lesson. For Maya, the moment crystallized into something stark and surreal. The cold steel of the tracks bit into her skin as he forced her down, binding her hands with rough rope that scraped her wrists raw. The distant rumble of the train grew louder. A steady pulse she could feel in her bones. Dan stood over her, arms crossed, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. This was his stage, his show, a twisted lesson in dominance. "You're awfully quiet now," he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not so tough sitting there, huh?" Maya's eyes met his, steady and unyielding, a storm brewing behind her silence. "You think this makes you strong?" she asked, her words calm but edged with steel. "You think this is what power looks like?" Dan smirked, crouching down to her level. His breath close enough for her to feel. "Power," he said slowly, savoring the word, "is making sure people like you know their place." The insult landed, sharp and deliberate, but Maya didn't flinch. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, her mind racing for an angle, a way to turn this back on him. "People like me," she echoed, her voice a quiet blade. "You mean people who don't cower? People who see through this sad little act you call authority?" His smirk flickered, a crack in his armor, and his eyes narrowed. "Careful," he warned, leaning closer, his tone low and menacing. "You don't want to make this worse." But Maya didn't back down. "What's the plan, Officer Grayson?" she pressed, her gaze locked on his. "Leave me here for the train to finish? Or pull me off at the last second to prove you're not a complete monster?" His jaw clenched, her composure gnawing at him, unraveling the control he clung to so desperately. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, she was supposed to break, to beg, to give him the satisfaction he craved. Instead, she sat there, bound but unbroken, her words slicing through his bravado. "You don't get to ask questions," he snapped, standing abruptly, his voice rising with his frustration. "You sit there and think about what happens when you cross me." The train horn blared again. Closer now, its echo bouncing off the rusted warehouses that stood like mute sentinels in the night. Maya felt the weight of it all, the rope, the tracks. The man looming over her, but she refused to let it show. She needed time, needed to burrow into his head the way he was trying to burrow into hers. "Do you even hear yourself?" she said. Her voice cutting through the thickening tension. "You talk about lines like you're some guardian of justice. But this? This is cowardice, plain and simple." Dan's face flushed, anger surging through him. "You don't know me," he snarled, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "So save your little speeches." But Maya didn't relent. "Don't I?" she shot back, her tone razor sharp. "I know exactly who you are, a man so afraid of losing his grip that he'll tie a woman to train tracks just to feel big. That's not power, Dan. That's desperation." Her words struck deep, peeling back the layers of his bravado, exposing the fragility beneath. For a moment, he faltered, his confidence shaken by the truth she wielded like a weapon. But he wouldn't let her see it, not yet. The train's rumble grew louder, the ground trembling beneath them, and the night stretched taut between them, a thread ready to snap. Neither of them knew it then, but this clash, raw, brutal, and unyielding, would ignite a reckoning. For Maya, it was a fight for survival. A stand against the abuse of power that festered in shadows like these. For Dan, it was the beginning of an unraveling, a lesson in justice that would echo far beyond this desolate stretch of tracks. The consequences of his actions, of his need to dominate, were hurtling toward him as surely as that train, and in the end, they would leave nothing unchanged. A flicker of doubt danced across Dan's face, brief as a shadow caught in the wind, before he smothered it beneath a mask of fury. "Shut up," he barked. His voice slicing through the tense air like a blade. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping harshly against the concrete floor, its screech echoing faintly in the cavernous space around them. "You don't have a clue what you're talking about." His words were sharp, meant to wound, but they trembled at the edges, betraying the storm brewing inside him. Maya, undeterred, leaned forward slightly, her steady gaze locking onto his. Her voice didn't waver, relentless as a river carving stone. "I know plenty, Dan. Enough to see through the smoke and mirrors. This isn't about me, it's about you. Your fear. Your fragility." Each syllable landed like a pebble tossed into still water, rippling outward, unsettling the fragile surface of his composure. Dan's fists tightened until his knuckles gleamed white under the dim light filtering through the cracked windows of the abandoned warehouse. He spun away from her, his broad shoulders hunching as if he could physically outrun the weight of her accusation. But her words clung to him, insidious, gnawing at the edges of the confidence he'd spent years building like a fortress. In the distance, the low rumble of an approaching train rolled through the night, growing louder with every heartbeat. Its horn blared, sharp and insistent, a sound that seemed to pulse in time with the chaos swirling in his mind. He could feel it, the vibration trembling through the ground beneath his boots. A reminder of how little time he had left to hold onto the reins of this spiraling moment. "Untie me," Maya said, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a lifeline. There was no plea in it, only a quiet demand that carried the weight of inevitability. "Do it before you cross a line you can't come back from." Dan froze, his hand hovering near the baton clipped to his belt. That baton had always been his scepter, a symbol of the control he wielded like a king over this small, dusty town. He was the law here, or so he'd convinced himself. But now, with her voice ringing in his ears and the train's roar closing in, that certainty felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Why did it feel like she was the one pulling the strings? "You think you're the first to try this?" Maya pressed on, her tone unshaken, as though she were speaking to a child throwing a tantrum. "The first to underestimate me? I've spent my whole life staring down men like you, men who think power comes from a badge or a weapon. But let me tell you something, Dan. You're not half as untouchable as you think." Her words were a mirror, reflecting back the cracks in his armor he'd refused to see. Dan whirled around, his face a storm of frustration and defiance. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he shouted, his voice rising to drown out the train's wail. "You think you can just stroll into my town and my town?" Maya cut in, her voice a whip crack, sharp enough to halt him mid-sentence. "This isn't your personal kingdom, Dan. It belongs to every soul who calls it home, every person you've stepped on to feel tall. And whether you like it or not, the world's shifting under your feet. People like you don't get to play gatekeeper anymore." Her eyes glinted with a fire that made his stomach twist. She wasn't just challenging him, she was dismantling the very foundation he stood on. The train's light pierced the darkness now, a blinding beacon slicing through the night, illuminating the grime-streaked walls and the rusted tracks just beyond the warehouse's shattered windows. Dan's gaze darted toward it, his breath hitching as the reality of his actions sank in. He'd meant to scare her, to remind her who held the power here. But now, with the train barreling closer, the weight of what he'd done pressed down on him, heavy as a vice tightening around his chest. "Untie me," Maya said again, her voice steady as steel. "Right now." He stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting impulses. He could end this, cut the ropes, walk away. Pretend this night never happened. But the way she looked at him, so calm, so certain, rooted him to the spot. Her composure was a blade held to his throat. And he didn't know how to step away from it. "What's it going to be, Grayson?" she asked, her eyes boring into his soul. "Are you going to prove me right, or show me you're not the coward I've pegged you for?" The question hung there, thick and heavy, a challenge wrapped in a warning. Dan's hands shook as he reached for the rope binding her wrists, his fingers brushing the coarse fibers of the knot. He hesitated. His gaze flickering between her unflinching stare and the blinding light of the train, now so close its horn was a deafening scream. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the concrete, cast by the glaring beam. His chest heaved, each breath a struggle as he wrestled with the decision. Then, something shifted, a subtle change in the air, electric and profound. Like the moment before a storm breaks. The train thundered nearer, and in that heartbeat, the pieces of this night began to fall into place. Though the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Whatever came next would rewrite everything they thought they knew. The horn's wail drowned out the world, leaving only the frantic thud of Maya's pulse in her ears. She felt the tracks vibrating beneath her, the tremor climbing up her spine as the train's roar swallowed the night. Dan stood a few feet away, paralyzed, his hand still hovering near the knot he'd tied with such arrogance hours before. His breathing was ragged. His face a mask of indecision as sweat beaded on his brow, glinting in the train's harsh light. "Dan," she said, her voice piercing the chaos. Firm and unyielding despite the rope still biting into her wrists. "Look at me." He flinched, his eyes darting wildly between her and the oncoming juggernaut. The rumble was unbearable now, shaking the very air around them. "Look at me, *," she repeated, louder, her command slicing through his panic. Against every instinct screaming in his head, he obeyed. Her gaze was a lighthouse in the storm, steady, unblinking, and utterly unnerving. For the first time that night, she didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like someone who'd already seen the ending and was waiting for him to catch up. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice even, deliberate. "Not because you're noble. Not because you'll feel guilty later. But because this moment will destroy you." Dan let out a scoff, but it was a weak, hollow sound, crumbling under the weight of her certainty. "Destroy me?" He shot back, though his bravado rang false even to his own ears. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Maya's lips curved into a faint smile, tinged with something close to pity. "I know enough," she replied softly, her words carrying a quiet menace. "Enough to see you've already stepped over a ledge you can't climb back from. But here's the thing, it's not too late to stop falling." The train was almost upon them now, its horn a relentless assault on their senses, echoing off the warehouse's skeletal frame. Dan's hand twitched. The rope so close he could feel its texture under his fingertips. He wanted to move, to act, to reclaim the control slipping from his grasp, but fear held him fast, a cold shackle around his heart. "You think you're the one calling the shots?" Maya continued, her voice rising just enough to cut through the din. "Look at yourself, Dan. You're unraveling. You're terrified, and you should be." His jaw tightened, fury bubbling up to mask the dread pooling in his gut. "Terrified of what, you?" he spat, but the words felt flimsy, a shield made of paper. "No," she said, tilting her head slightly, her expression almost serene. "Not me. Terrified of what happens when the world sees you for what you really are." Her words crashed into him like a tidal wave, shattering the fragile illusion he'd built around himself. The train's light bathed them in stark white, the final seconds ticking down like a bomb. In a flash of desperation, Dan lunged forward, his trembling fingers fumbling with the knot. It was tight, stubborn, a testament to his earlier confidence, but he clawed at it, loosening it just enough. Maya's wrists slipped free, and she rolled back instinctively, away from the tracks, as the train roared past, its wind whipping her hair across her face. For a moment, the world held its breath. The air crackled with the aftermath, heavy and charged, as the train's thunder faded into the distance. Dan stumbled backward, his chest heaving, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Maya sat on the ground a few feet away, her breathing steady but her eyes locked on him with an intensity that cut deeper than any blade. "You think that's the end of it?" she asked. Her voice calm but edged with steel. "You think letting me go wipes the slate clean?" He couldn't answer. Words failed him as he stared at her, the quicksand of his choices pulling him under. The control he'd gripped so fiercely was gone, replaced by a cold, dawning realization that left him hollow. Maya rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands with deliberate care. Each movement a quiet declaration of her regained power. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked, her tone soft but weighted with unspoken truths. Dan shook his head, a faint, helpless gesture. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the lingering echo of the train. Her lips twitched into a smile, cold and devoid of warmth. "You will," she said simply. Reaching into her jacket, she pulled out a sleek black wallet and flipped it open. The badge gleamed under the faint moonlight, FBI, Special Agent Maya Brooks. Dan's eyes widened, his breath catching as the sight hit him like a sledgehammer, obliterating the last vestiges of his authority. "Why you?" he stammered, but the words died in his throat. "That's right," Maya said, snapping the wallet shut and tucking it away with a practiced motion. "I've been here for weeks. Watching. Listening. Building a case. And tonight, Dan? Tonight. You handed me the final piece on a silver platter." He staggered back, his mind reeling, the warehouse walls closing in around him. "You can't," he began, but she cut him off, her voice rising with a controlled fire. "Can't what? Hold you accountable? Drag your name through the mud you've made for yourself? Let me tell you something, Dan, this isn't just about me. It's about every person you've ever bullied, every life you've crushed under your boot because you thought no one would dare stop you." Her words were a reckoning, each one a brick pulled from the crumbling tower of his pride. He shook his head, desperation clawing at his voice. "I was just." "Just what?" she snapped, stepping closer, her presence towering despite her smaller frame. "Just doing your job? Just keeping order?" "No, Dan. You were drunk on power, and you abused it. But justice doesn't bend for men like you, not anymore." She paused, letting the silence settle, heavy with the consequences of his actions. "You thought you could silence me, scare me into submission. But all you did was prove how weak you really are when the spotlight turns on you." The lesson hung unspoken between them: power, when wielded without restraint, becomes a noose. Dan had tied it himself, loop by loop, with every threat, every overstep. And now, as Maya stood before him, not a victim, but a harbinger of his downfall, he saw the truth. The world he'd ruled with an iron fist was slipping away, and the consequences of his arrogance were closing in, relentless and unforgiving. Whatever came next, one thing was certain. Neither of them would walk away unchanged. The night was heavy with a stillness that seemed to press down on everything, broken only by the faint, mournful wail of a train slicing through the distance. Maya stood firm, her boots planted on the cracked pavement, her breath visible in the chilly air as she stepped closer to Dan. Her voice cut through the silence like a whip, sharp and unyielding. Just doing your job? Just teaching me a lesson? Don't insult me, Dan. And don't you dare insult yourself. Each word landed like a stone, piling up until the weight of them seemed to crush the last fragile shards of his confidence. Dan's eyes flickered away, unable to hold her piercing stare. His chest tightening with a sensation he hadn't felt in years, shame, raw and unfamiliar, clawing at his insides. Maya took a deliberate step back. Her face a mask of hard edges and unreadable depths. She studied him for a moment, her silence louder than any accusation. Then, with a voice as steady as stone, she said, "You're done. You just haven't realized it yet." She turned to leave, her coat swirling slightly in the night breeze, but Dan's voice, hollow, brittle, almost pleading, stopped her mid-stride. "What happens now?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a desperate gasp. Maya paused, glancing back over her shoulder, her dark eyes glinting under the faint streetlight. "Now," she replied. Her tone cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "Now you answer for what you've done. And trust me, Dan, you're not going to like where this road ends." Her footsteps echoed as she walked away. Each one fading into the night, leaving Dan alone with the suffocating burden of his own choices. The distant rumble of the trains lingered. A ghostly reminder of the line he'd nearly crossed, a line that, once breached, could never be undone. For the first time in his life, Dan Grayson, a man who'd built his world on control, felt utterly powerless. He stood frozen, rooted to the spot as the echoes of Maya's departure dissolved into the vast emptiness around him. The cold bit deeper now, seeping through his jacket and wrapping around him like a vice. His hands trembled as he stared down at them. The faint red mark from the rope still etched into his skin, a silent accusation he couldn't escape. His breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts. His mind a chaotic storm of fragmented thoughts he couldn't piece together. The sudden growl of a car engine jolted him from his spiraling daze. He turned, squinting as the glow of headlights pierced the darkness, growing brighter as they approached. For a fleeting moment, the wild idea of running flickered through his mind, vanishing into the night, leaving everything behind. But deep down, he knew it was futile. His carefully woven life had already begun to unravel, thread by thread. The car rolled to a stop, its tires crunching against the gravel. Maya stepped out first, her calm demeanor unshaken, a quiet storm of resolve in her every movement. But she wasn't alone this time. A second figure emerged from the passenger side, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose presence seemed to fill the space around him. Deputy Director Alan Reeves. His name alone carried a weight that reverberated far beyond the small, gritty town of Montrose. His face was stern, etched with a no-nonsense authority that made the air feel heavier. Dan's stomach lurched as recognition hit him like a punch. Reeves strode forward, his steps slow and deliberate, each one a drumbeat of impending reckoning. "Sergeant Grayson," he said. His voice steady but edged with a sharpness that sliced through the tension. "We need to talk." Dan swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper, his voice cracking as he stammered. This isn't what it looks like." Maya let out a short, bitter laugh, her arms crossing as she leaned casually against the car's hood. "Isn't it?" she shot back, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is, an abuse of power, plain and simple." Her words stung, and Dan's head jerked toward her. His eyes narrowing as a flicker of defiance flared within him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with a mix of anger and desperation. "This wasn't." "Save it," Reeves interrupted, raising a hand to cut him off. His tone was firm, unyielding, leaving no room for argument. "We've heard enough excuses tonight. What I need from you now is the truth." Dan's lips parted. the word truth echoing in his mind like a mocking taunt. He glanced between Reeves and Maya, their combined scrutiny pressing down on him like a physical weight. His chest tightened further. Each breath a struggle. The truth is, he faltered, his voice barely holding together, I didn't mean for it to go that far. Maya straightened, stepping forward with a fire blazing in her eyes. Didn't mean for it to go that far, she repeated, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. You tied me to train tracks, Dan. What exactly was the line you weren't planning to cross? Her words hit him like a slap, and he opened his mouth to respond, scrambling for something, anything, to say. But the words wouldn't come. He looked to Reeves, searching for a shred of sympathy. But the man's expression remained an impenetrable wall of ice. You think this is about one night? Reeves asked, his voice low but commanding, resonating with a quiet fury. This is about a pattern. Grayson. A pattern of behavior that's been festering under the excuse of keeping the peace. And tonight, you handed us all the evidence we needed to drag it into the light. Dan's stomach plummeted. A sickening dread pooling inside him. He stumbled back a step, shaking his head as if he could deny the reality closing in around him. You don't know what it's like here, he said. His voice cracking with desperation. This town, it's different. You have to be tough, or people walk all over you. Tough? Maya cut in, her voice rising with incredulity. Is that what you call it? Tough? Because what I saw tonight wasn't toughness, Dan. It was fear, fear of losing the control you've wrapped your entire identity around. Her words struck deep, igniting a surge of frustration that boiled over. Dan's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. You don't know anything about me, he snapped, his voice raw with emotion. You don't know what I've had to deal with in this town, the kind of people I've had to face. Reeves stepped closer, his towering presence looming like a thundercloud ready to break. And what about the people who've had to deal with you, he asked, his tone frigid and unrelenting. The ones who've borne the brunt of your so-called toughness? Do you think they'd see you as the hero you've convinced yourself you are? Dan's mouth opened, then closed, his defenses crumbling under the weight of their accusations. He had no answer. No shield left to hide behind. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the reality of his actions settled over him like a shroud. You made a choice tonight, Reeves continued. His voice a steady hammer driving each point home. A choice that doesn't just reflect on you, it reflects on this department, this town, and every officer who wears that badge. And now, you'll face the consequences. Dan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him like water through a sieve. He looked at Maya, his voice barely a whisper. What happens now? Her expression softened for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something human beneath her resolve, but her voice remained firm. Now, she said, the truth comes out. All of it. And you face the justice you've denied so many others. Reeves gestured toward the car with a curt nod. Get in, he ordered. We'll finish this downtown. Dan hesitated. His feet heavy as if cemented to the ground. He glanced back at the tracks, the memory of the train's roar still vibrating in his bones. Finally, with a slow nod, he shuffled toward the car. Each step a surrender to the inevitable. As the vehicle pulled away, the industrial sprawl fell silent once more, the night swallowing the echoes of what had transpired, leaving only ghosts in its wake. Maya lingered, watching the taillights vanish into the distance. Her face was a blank canvas, unreadable even to herself. She took a deep breath, letting the tension seep from her shoulders, though she knew this was only the beginning of a much longer fight. Back at the precinct, the air buzzed with a restless energy as she and Reeves led Dan inside. Officers glanced up from their desks, their eyes wide with a mix of confusion and unease. Whispers rippled through the room like wildfire, hushed and urgent, though no one dared speak aloud. Reeves stepped forward, his voice booming with authority. "Sergeant Grayson is now under investigation for misconduct," he announced. "Effective immediately, he is relieved of his duties. Any questions, direct them to me." The room fell deathly quiet. The shock of his words reverberating like a thunderclap. Dan stood motionless, his face pale as two officers approached to escort him down the hall. Maya watched him go, her mind already racing ahead to the battles yet to come. Reeves turned to her, his stern features softening slightly. "You did good tonight," he said, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "But this is just the start." Maya nodded, her jaw set with unwavering determination. "I know," she replied. "And I'm ready." As the night stretched into the early hours, the precinct grew eerily still, a thick, oppressive tension hanging over it like a storm waiting to break. Maya sat alone in a small room, her hands resting on the cool desk as she sifted through her notes. The events of the night replayed in her mind with vivid clarity, every word, every gesture, every moment of reckoning. She wasn't just compiling a report, she was arming herself for the war ahead. Across the hall, Dan sat in a stark interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. His hands rested on the table, still trembling faintly, the rope's imprint a fading scar on his skin. He stared at the wall, his mind a tangle of regret and disbelief. He'd always seen himself as the protector, the one who held Montrose together through sheer force of will. But now, stripped of his badge and his bravado, he was just a man, small, fragile, and facing the consequences of a power he'd wielded too recklessly for too long. The lesson was clear, etched into the night's events like a warning carved in stone: justice, when denied to others, eventually circles back with a vengeance. And for those who abuse their authority, the fall is not just a punishment, it's a mirror, reflecting the truth they've long refused to see. For Maya, it was a step toward righting the scales, not just for herself, but for every voice silenced by Dan's reign. For him, it was the beginning of an end he could no longer outrun. The interrogation room was a stark, unforgiving space, its walls painted a dull gray that seemed to absorb any trace of warmth or hope. Dan sat at the cold metal table, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned a ghostly white, as if he could squeeze away the dread gnawing at his insides. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, casting jagged shadows that danced across his weathered face. Each line etched into his skin told a story, of sleepless nights, barked orders, and a simmering frustration that had hardened into something ugly over the years. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, were locked on the empty chair across from him. His mind churned like a storm at sea, tossing up excuses, denials, and half-formed defenses, but no matter how fast his thoughts raced, the crushing weight of reality pinned him down, a boulder too massive to shove aside, too real to ignore. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning in the silence, and Dan's body tensed, though he barely flinched. Reeves stepped in first, his broad frame filling the doorway for a moment before he moved aside to let Maya enter. She carried a thick folder under her arm, its edges worn and bulging with secrets waiting to spill out. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as if she were pacing out the beats of a carefully rehearsed performance. She slid into the chair opposite Dan, her posture straight but not rigid, exuding a quiet confidence that made the air feel heavier. Reeves, meanwhile, took up his post against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, his silence a looming presence that spoke louder than words. Maya set the folder down with a soft thud, her fingers lingering on its cover before she opened it, revealing a cascade of papers, photographs, typed reports, handwritten notes, all laid out like pieces of a puzzle she'd already solved. She flipped through the contents with a methodical grace, Her face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the fire Dan knew was burning beneath. "Sergeant Grayson," she began, her voice crisp and formal, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Let's skip the pleasantries. This isn't just about what happened tonight. Tonight was merely the final note in a symphony of misconduct we've been tracking for months, a pattern that's grown too loud to ignore." Dan's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing as if he could bite back the accusation. "You're trying to twist this," he shot back, his tone sharp with defiance but trembling at the edges. "You're painting me as some kind of monster, but I was out there doing my job, keeping this town safe, holding the line when no one else would." Maya's gaze locked onto his, her eyes piercing and unyielding, like twin beams of light cutting through his bluster. "Safe for who, Dan?" she countered, her voice steady but edged with something fierce. "Because from where I'm sitting, your version of safety seems to have a lot of exceptions. The evidence we've piled up here," she tapped the folder lightly, "shows a man whose idea of protection was selective at best, and at worst, a mask for something vicious." She reached into the stack and slid a photograph across the table, its glossy surface catching the light. It showed a young black man, his face a map of bruises and swelling, one eye nearly shut from the damage. "Take a look," she said, her tone daring him to dismiss it. "Do you know him?" Dan's eyes darted to the image, a flicker of recognition sparking before he jerked his gaze away, as if the sight burned him. "I don't keep track of every face I run into," he muttered, his voice low and rough, clinging to indifference. Maya leaned forward, closing the distance between them, her presence suddenly overwhelming. "His name is Marcus Holloway," she said, her words slow and deliberate, each syllable landing like a stone. "Last year, you pulled him over for a broken taillight, a nothing stop, routine, or at least it should have been. But it didn't end there, did it? It ended with him in a hospital bed, clinging to consciousness. While your report conveniently skipped the part where you beat him senseless." "That's not how it went down," Dan snapped, but the protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. A desperate grab at a lifeline that wasn't there. Maya arched an eyebrow, her skepticism a silent challenge. "No," she said, pulling a second document from the folder and laying it beside the photo. "Because the witnesses who saw it unfold tell a very different tale. And then there's the dash cam footage. Oh, wait, that mysteriously vanished after the incident, didn't it?" Dan shifted in his seat, his face flushing a deep red, a cocktail of anger and shame bubbling up inside him. "I did what I had to," he growled, his teeth gritted so hard they might crack. He was resisting. "Resisting?" Maya echoed, her voice dripping with disbelief, sharp enough to cut through his flimsy excuse. "Resisting what, exactly? Being treated like a criminal over a busted light? Being humiliated? Or worse, just for existing in your path?" Before Dan could muster a response, Reeves broke his silence, his voice rolling into the room like distant thunder, calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "This isn't about one bad night, Grayson. We've got a list, names, dates, incidents, and your name's a recurring theme. Too many times to call it chance." Dan's chest tightened, his breath shallow as he glanced between them, fear and defiance wrestling in his gut. "You don't get it," he said, his voice rising, cracking under the strain. "Out there, it's chaos. People don't respect the badge anymore, they push, they defy you at every turn. If you're not hard, they'll trample you." Maya's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing as she leaned in closer, her words slicing through his justification like a surgeon's scalpel. "Hardness isn't the same as brutality, Dan. Real strength is doing the job right, holding the line with honor. Even when it's messy. What you've been doing, that's not strength. It's weakness dressed up as power." The fight drained from Dan's face, his mouth opening only to close again, words failing him. He slumped back in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight, and for the first time, the enormity of his situation crashed over him like a tidal wave. Reeves stepped forward. His boots scuffing the floor, and planted a hand on the table, his presence looming over Dan. "You've got two roads here," he said, his tone even but firm. "You can work with us, lay it all out. Every dirty detail, and maybe claw back a shred of the man you used to be. Or you can double down, deny it all, and we'll let the mountain of evidence we've got bury you alive. Your call." The room fell into a suffocating silence, Reeves' ultimatum hanging like a noose in the air. Dan stared at the table, his mind a chaotic swirl of dread, regret, and fleeting glimpses of the life he'd built, the career he'd poured himself into, the badge he'd worn like a second skin. That badge, once a source of pride, now felt like a brand, marking him with a darkness he'd never fully faced until this moment. "What happens if I cooperate?" he asked finally, his voice a fragile whisper, barely audible over the hum of the lights. Maya eased back in her chair, a flicker of something softer, pity, perhaps, crossing her face. "You tell us everything," she said, her tone steady but not unkind. "Not just your part, but anyone else in the department who's been tangled up in this mess. You help us dig out the rot, root and stem. And we'll talk leniency. How your case gets handled might not be as brutal as it could be." Dan lifted his eyes to hers, desperation swimming in his gaze. "And if I don't?" Reeves answered this time, his voice cold as steel. "Then you'll face justice head-on, Grayson. And believe me, it's a machine that doesn't bend, it'll grind you to dust." The words landed like a hammer, final and unyielding. Dan closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging as the full weight of his reality settled into his bones. For years, he'd fought to feel big, to wield power over the chaos, but now he felt small. Fragile, a man stripped bare by his own choices. "I'll cooperate," he said at last, his voice trembling, raw with surrender. "I'll tell you everything." Maya and Reeves shared a glance, their faces unreadable masks of resolve and quiet triumph. Maya rose, gathering the papers with a brisk efficiency. "Good," she said simply, her tone clipped but carrying a warning. "But don't think this wipes the slate clean, Dan. It's just the first step toward fixing the wreckage you've left behind." As they left, the door clanged shut behind them, leaving Dan alone in the oppressive silence. He sat there, head cradled in his hands, the cold metal of the table seeping into his skin. The decision to cooperate wasn't just a confession, it was a betrayal of the code he'd lived by, the unspoken pact among officers that had justified every overreach, every swing of his fist. He'd always told himself it was about order, about survival, but now the lie crumbled, leaving only the bitter truth: he'd abused the power entrusted to him. And the consequences were finally catching up. The door creaked open again, jolting him from his spiraling thoughts. A younger officer stepped inside, his uniform crisp but his expression uncertain, as if he wasn't sure how to address the man he'd once looked up to. "Sergeant Grayson," he said, his voice soft, almost reluctant, "they want you to start writing your statement." Dan looked up, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion and grief, and gave a slow, weary nod. He stood, his legs shaky, each movement a battle against the weight pressing down on him. The officer led him down a dim hallway to a smaller office, a cramped, windowless box with a desk, a chair, and a stack of blank forms waiting like a judgment. Dan sank into the seat, the chair groaning under him, and picked up the pen with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. He stared at the empty page, the white expanse mocking him, daring him to spill the ugliness he'd kept buried. The first words came slowly, each letter a struggle: "I abused my authority." The pen hovered, his breath catching as the truth clawed its way out, tearing at the walls he'd built around his conscience. He forced himself to keep going. The ink bleeding across the page as he recounted years of choices he could no longer defend, every stop that turned violent, every report he'd twisted, every life he'd scarred. The minutes stretched into hours, the small room closing in around him as he wrote. His handwriting grew jagged, the lines slanting as anger, guilt, and shame stormed through him. He thought of Marcus Holloway, the young man whose face stared back from that photograph, his eyes pleading for a mercy Dan hadn't given. He thought of others, nameless faces now blending into a gallery of pain, each one a testament to the arrogance he'd worn like armor. The pen slipped from his grip more than once. His hands shaking too hard to hold it steady, but he pressed on, page after page, until the stack of papers grew into a monument of his failures. When he finally stopped, the pen clattered to the desk, and he leaned back, staring at the mess of words in front of him. His chest heaved, his breaths ragged, as if he'd run a marathon through the wreckage of his own life. The young officer returned, hesitating at the door, his eyes flicking to the pile of confessions with a mix of awe and unease. "They'll take it from here, sir," he said quietly. And Dan wondered if the "sir" was habit or pity. He didn't respond, didn't move, just sat there as the officer collected the papers and left him alone again. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the faint hum of the building around him. Dan's mind replayed the years, every moment he'd justified as necessary, every time he'd told himself the ends outweighed the means. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a word, it was a force, relentless and impartial, and it had finally turned its gaze on him. The lesson sank deep: power, when twisted, didn't just destroy its victims, it eroded the wielder, too, leaving behind a hollow shell. For Dan, the road ahead loomed long and brutal, but in the quiet, he glimpsed a faint hope, a chance to claw his way back, not to who he'd been, but to something better, if he could find the courage to face the reckoning he'd earned. The room felt suffocatingly small as Dan sat there, his trembling hands resting on the scratched wooden table. For the first time in years, he didn't scramble to concoct excuses or weave justifications for the choices he'd made. Instead, he let the truth settle over him like a heavy, unyielding fog, a ledger of his missteps. Etched into the papers sprawled before him. Each sheet catalogued a failure, a moment where he'd chosen power over principle, silence over courage. His chest tightened as he stared at them, the weight of his own admissions pressing down until it felt like he might collapse under it. The door creaked open, slicing through the oppressive stillness, and Maya stepped into the room. Her presence carried an understated authority, her boots clicking softly against the worn linoleum floor. Behind her trailed Reeves, his broad frame filling the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the space as though cataloging every detail. Maya's gaze flicked to the scattered documents, her face a mask of cool detachment as she approached the table. She reached for the papers, her slender fingers flipping through them with deliberate care, as if she could sense the gravity of each word without reading it. Then, with a quiet grace, she sank into the chair across from Dan, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. "Is it all there?" she asked, her voice steady and unshakable, though it carried an edge that demanded honesty. Dan swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw, the sound of his own hoarse reply barely registering in his ears. "Everything I could remember," he rasped, his eyes darting to the table, unable to meet hers. Maya studied him for a long, agonizing moment, her dark eyes piercing through the layers of his defenses. She was searching. He knew, probing for cracks in his story, testing whether this sudden candor was genuine or just another act of self-preservation. At last, she set the papers aside with a soft thud and leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. "Why now, Dan?" she pressed, her tone quieter but no less firm. "Why cooperate after all these years of pretending nothing was wrong?" Dan's breath hitched, his gaze dropping to the table's scarred surface as shame coiled in his gut. He could feel the answer clawing its way up, raw and unfiltered, but speaking it aloud felt like tearing himself open. "Because I can't live with it anymore," he admitted, his voice a fragile whisper, barely audible over the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. "I've spent years convincing myself I was doing the right thing, telling myself I was protecting this town, keeping it safe. But the truth is, all I've done is hurt people. Good people. People who didn't deserve any of it." His hands clenched into fists, knuckles widening as the confession spilled out, each word a jagged shard of regret. Maya's expression softened, just a flicker. But her voice held its measured resolve. "And what about the others?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "The ones who helped you build this mess, the ones who egged you on, turned a blind eye. Or even joined in. Are you ready to give them up?" The question hit Dan like a punch to the stomach, twisting his insides into knots. He knew exactly what she was asking, and he understood the cost. Loyalty was the unspoken currency among the officers, a sacred, unshakable bond forged in late-night shifts and shared secrets. To break it was to invite exile. To become a ghost in the very halls he'd once commanded. But silence, he realized, was no longer an option. It was a chain that would bind him, and the town, to the same rotting corruption he'd helped nurture. "I'll tell you everything," he said at last. His voice steadying even as fear gnawed at his resolve. "Names, dates, every detail I can give you." He lifted his eyes to meet hers, and in that moment, he saw something shift in her gaze, a glint of respect tempered by wariness. Maya nodded slowly, leaning back in her chair. "Good," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "But let's be clear, Dan. Cooperating doesn't make you some kind of savior. It doesn't erase the pain you've caused or the lives you've broken. This is just the beginning, the first step toward owning up to what you've done." Her words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding, and Dan felt them settle into his bones. He nodded, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "I know," he murmured, his voice barely above a breath. "I'm not looking for forgiveness. I just want to make it right." Reeves, who had lingered silently by the door like a sentinel, finally stepped forward. His deep voice cutting through the room. "Making it right starts with the truth, Grayson," he said, his tone gruff but laced with an undercurrent of conviction. "But it doesn't stop there. You're going to have to face what comes next, every consequence, every fallout. No shortcuts." Dan's shoulders sagged under the weight of those words, but he nodded again. The reality of his path sinking in. This wasn't about washing his hands clean or chasing some hollow redemption. It was about justice, raw, unsparing justice, and the bitter truth that power, when wielded without restraint, left scars that no apology could heal. Over the next few days, the small, dimly lit office became a crucible of reckoning. Dan sat hunched over the table, his voice hoarse as he recounted years of buried secrets to Maya and Reeves. He spoke of hushed deals struck in shadowed corners, of brutality cloaked as duty, of evidence buried to shield the guilty. Each name he uttered, officers he'd once called brothers, felt like a betrayal, yet he pressed on, driven by a desperate need to unburden himself. The precinct buzzed with unease as whispers of the investigation spread like wildfire. Some officers avoided him entirely, their eyes sliding past him in the hallways as though he were a plague. Others didn't hold back, their fury erupting in sharp, venomous confrontations. One afternoon, in the cramped locker room, a burly officer named Harris cornered him, his face flushed with rage. "You're a disgrace," Harris spat, his voice dripping with contempt as he loomed over Dan. "You think spilling your guts is going to save your sorry hide? All you've done is drag the rest of us into your mess." The word stung, but Dan didn't flinch. He stood there, silent and still, absorbing the venom like a penance. He didn't argue or defend himself, he couldn't. The insults were a small price to pay compared to the wreckage he'd left behind, and he knew it. Maya, meanwhile, wrestled with her own storm of emotions as the days wore on. She'd seen cases like this before, men drowning in their own corruption, clawing for a lifeline, but Dan's unraveling hit her differently. Sitting across from him hour after hour, she couldn't fully trust the man who'd spent decades upholding a broken system. How could she? When his hands were stained with the same injustices she'd sworn to dismantle? Yet there was something in his eyes, a weary, fractured sincerity, that gnawed at her skepticism. He was trying, however imperfectly, to claw his way towards something better. One evening, as they pored over a stack of reports in the cluttered conference room, she broke the silence that had stretched between them. "Why now, Dan?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, tinged with a curiosity she couldn't suppress. "Why not years ago? When you first saw how rotten this all was?" Dan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion carving deep lines into his face. "Because I was terrified," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "Terrified of losing everything, my badge, my standing, the life I'd built. I didn't want to face the fact that I wasn't just caught in the system, I was the system." But after that night, he trailed off, his eyes distant, haunted by a memory he wouldn't name. "I couldn't keep lying to myself." Maya leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table as she studied him. "Fear can twist people into doing awful things," she said, her tone thoughtful but firm. "It can also be the push they need to turn it around. The real question is, are you in this for the long haul, or is this just another shield to hide behind?" Dan met her gaze, unflinching despite the weariness dragging at him. "I don't care about saving myself anymore," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to do what's right." She nodded slowly, a flicker of reluctant admiration stirring in her chest, though she kept her guard firmly in place. There were no clean slates here, only the slow, grueling work of accountability, a lesson in justice that rippled far beyond Dan's confession. As weeks bled into months, the investigation swelled into a relentless tide, washing away the carefully constructed lies of the Montrose Police Department. Dan became its unlikely linchpin, his testimony peeling back decades of rot, cover-ups, unchecked violence, a culture steeped in fear and impunity. Each day brought fresh revelations, and with them, the department's facade crumbled further. Maya threw herself into the work, her nights stretching into bleary dawns as she sifted through reports, interviewed survivors, and pieced together a mosaic of pain long ignored. The weight of it all pressed on her relentlessly, the stories of shattered lives, the echoes of voices silenced by those meant to protect them. Late one evening, she sat alone in her makeshift office, the glow of her laptop casting harsh shadows across her face. She was reviewing Dan's latest statement when a tentative knock jolted her from her focus. "Come in," she called, her voice flat as she snapped the laptop shut. Dan stepped inside, his posture hunched, his face gaunt and hollowed by weeks of strain. He lingered near the door, uncertain, as though he feared the ground beneath him might give way. "What is it, Dan?" she asked, leaning back in her chair, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. I needed to ask you something," he said, his voice low and halting. She gestured to the chair across from her, and he sank into it slowly, his hands twisting together in his lap. "Do you think any of this will matter?" he asked, doubt threading through his words. "Do you think people will look at this town, at me, and believe things can actually change?" Maya considered him for a long moment, her thoughts churning behind her unreadable stare. "Change doesn't come fast or easy," she said at last. "But what we're doing here, it's a spark. A beginning." Dan shook his head, frustration flashing in his eyes. "A beginning isn't enough," he muttered. Not for the people I've hurt, the lives I've torn apart. I don't know if I can ever balance that scale. Maya's voice softened, though her resolve didn't waver. You can't undo what's done, Dan. But you get to decide who you are from here on out. That's the power you still have. He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with a fragile mix of guilt and determination. I want to make it right, he said quietly. I just don't know if I've got what it takes. That's for you to figure out. She replied, her tone even but not unkind. Making it right doesn't mean everyone's going to absolve you. It doesn't mean you walk away clean. It just means you keep showing up, day after day, to face what you've done. Dan nodded, absorbing her words like a man clinging to a lifeline. The road ahead was long and unforgiving, but in that moment, he glimpsed the faint outline of a purpose, a chance to rebuild, not for himself, but for the justice he'd once betrayed. And as the investigation pressed forward, the lesson burned clearer with every step. Power abused left wreckage in its wake, but accountability, however late, could light the way to something better. The air in the dimly lit precinct office was thick with unspoken tension as Dan lingered by the door. His broad shoulders slumped under the weight of a realization that had been creeping up on him for weeks. Maya's words echoed in his mind like a persistent drumbeat, doing the hard work, even when no one was watching. He nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, as though each dip of his chin was an admission of a truth he'd spent years dodging. Her voice, steady and unyielding, cut through the haze of his thoughts, and as it sank in, he felt a heaviness settle into his bones. His boots scuffed against the worn linoleum floor as he turned to leave, the sound a quiet testament to the burden he carried. But just before he crossed the threshold, he stopped, his hand resting on the doorframe. He glanced back at her, his hazel eyes catching the faint glow of the desk lamp. Thanks, he murmured, the single word raw with sincerity, a fragile bridge between them. Maya gave a slight nod, her dark hair shifting as she leaned back in her chair, the creak of the springs punctuating the silence. She watched him go, her breath escaping in a long, slow exhale that seemed to carry away some of the tension coiled in her chest. She wanted to trust that Dan's change of heart was real, that the man she'd seen glimpses of beneath the gruff exterior was emerging for good. Yet years spent navigating the murky waters of law enforcement had sharpened her cynicism into a blade she couldn't easily sheathe. Still, a flicker of hope danced in the recesses of her mind, hope that he'd prove her wrong, not just for his own redemption, but for the fractured soul of Montrose itself. The next morning dawned gray and restless, the precinct humming with a nervous energy that prickled the skin. Federal agents swept in like a storm, their polished badges glinting under the fluorescent lights as they barked orders and snapped handcuffs onto wrists. Officers who'd once strutted through these halls with an air of invincibility were now reduced to stunned silence or defiant glares, their navy uniforms rumpled as they were escorted out. The scene unfolded like a grim theater production, each arrest a stark lesson etched into the air. Justice didn't bend for anyone, no matter how untouchable they believed themselves to be. Dan stood at the edge of the chaos, his breath shallow, his chest tightening as familiar faces flashed before him, colleagues he'd shared coffee with, swapped stories with, even called friends. Now, they were strangers caught in a web he'd helped weave. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless ache that made his hands tremble as he shoved them into his pockets. He'd handed over names, dates, details, pieces of a puzzle that had once protected him but now condemned those he'd stood beside. The weight of it pressed down like a physical force, threatening to crush him where he stood. Maya approached, her footsteps deliberate against the tiled floor, her expression a carefully crafted mask of neutrality. But her eyes, sharp, piercing, betrayed the intensity of her focus. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" she said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the din of slamming doors and muffled protests. Dan nodded, his throat tight, his words scraping out like gravel. "I thought I'd feel relieved," he confessed, his gaze dropping to the scuffed toes of his boots. "But it's just empty." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were a case file she hadn't quite solved. "Accountability isn't supposed to feel good, Dan," she replied, her tone firm yet not unkind. "It's supposed to feel necessary." He looked up at her then, his eyes brimming with questions he didn't know how to voice, questions about guilt, about redemption, about the people he'd left bleeding in his wake. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, fragile and frayed. "The ones I've hurt?" Maya paused, the silence stretching between them as she weighed her response. "Forgiveness isn't something you can demand," she said at last, her words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. "It's something you earn, step by step, and even then, it might never come. All you can do is try to mend what you've broken and hope it's enough." Dan nodded again, though her answer offered no solace, only a cold, hard truth he'd have to carry. He knew she was right, forgiveness wasn't his to claim. It was a distant shore he'd have to swim toward, one grueling stroke at a time. In the weeks that followed, Montrose wrestled with the aftermath like a town waking from a long, troubled sleep. The arrests had ripped through the community like a jagged blade, leaving behind a tangle of outrage, disbelief, and a desperate clamor for something better. The local diner buzzed with heated debates over steaming cups of coffee, while community leaders gathered in the town hall, their voices rising and falling as they grappled with how to rebuild trust where it had been shattered. Federal officials lingered, their crisp suits a stark contrast to the weathered faces of the townsfolk, working tirelessly to root out the corruption that had festered for years. Dan found himself caught in the eye of this storm, a reluctant figure whose actions had sparked both gratitude and venom. To some, he was a hero, a man who'd finally torn down the veil of silence. To others, he was a turncoat, a coward who'd sold out his own to save his skin. The duality haunted him, shadowing his every step as he moved through streets that no longer felt like home. Maya, meanwhile, was nearing the end of her time in Montrose, her sharp mind already turning toward her next assignment. She spent her final days in a flurry of activity, poring over reports, meeting with officials, ensuring the reforms she'd fought for would endure long after she was gone. On her last evening, she stood outside the precinct, the sky ablaze with hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods, and for a moment, she let herself feel the weight of what she'd accomplished, and what she was leaving behind. Dan approached hesitantly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, his breath visible in the crisp air. "You're leaving," he said, the words flat, more a realization than a question. Maya nodded, her gaze steady. "My part here is done," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "But the real work, for you, for this town, it's just beginning." Dan shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on the cracked pavement as though searching for answers in its fissures. "I wanted to say thank you," he said finally, lifting his gaze to meet hers, "for not giving up on this, on me, when it would have been easier to walk away." Maya's expression softened, just for a moment, though her tone held its edge. "I didn't do this for you, Dan," she said, her words cutting through the quiet. "I did it for the people who deserved better. Don't forget that." Her rebuke stung, but it landed true, and he nodded, absorbing it like a man taking his medicine. As she turned to leave, her silhouette fading into the twilight, Dan stood rooted to the spot, watching until she was gone. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, but for the first time, a spark of possibility flickered within him, a chance to rebuild, to atone, to become something more than the sum of his mistakes. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. Months later, Montrose was a town in flux, its once stagnant air crackling with the promise, and the pain, of change. The reforms Maya had championed were taking hold. Though not without pushback from those who clung to the old ways. The scars of corruption ran deep, etched into the community's memory like cracks in stone, and healing came in fits and starts. Yet there was progress, a slow, uneven shift towards something brighter. Dan Grayson was no longer the man he'd been. The sergeant's badge, once a gleaming emblem of power, was gone. Stripped away along with the uniform he'd worn for over a decade. He'd stood in a courtroom, head bowed, pleading guilty to misconduct. His voice steady but his hands shaking as he faced the consequences of his past. Cooperation had spared him a harsher fate, but the trial had been a crucible. Each testimony a mirror reflecting the damage he'd wrought. Now, he served his sentence through community service, a task he'd initially approached with dread. His pride chafing at the thought of laboring among those he'd once dismissed. But as he swept floors, painted walls, and hauled supplies, something shifted. He began to see the faces he'd ignored, the shopkeepers, the single mothers, the kids who'd once flinched at his shadow, and the depth of their wounds became achingly clear. One humid afternoon. As he brushed a fresh coat of white paint onto the peeling walls of the community center, an older woman approached. Mrs. Carter moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who'd weathered too many storms, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes sharp with a mix of weariness and resolve. She'd been a thorn in the department's side for years, her voice rising at town meetings long before the investigation broke, demanding justice for her grandson, a bright, lanky boy whose life had been upended by one of Dan's wrongful arrests. "You're the one who finally told the truth," she said. Her tone heavy with judgment but laced with a curiosity that caught him off guard. Dan paused, the paintbrush dripping in his hand, and turned to face her. "I'm trying to make things right," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it doesn't undo what I've done, but I'm trying." Mrs. Carter studied him, her gaze piercing through the layers of his defenses. Searching for something, sincerity, perhaps, or the ghost of the man he'd been. After a long moment, she nodded, a small, grudging gesture. "Good," she said, her voice firm. "But don't just try, do." Her words lodged in his chest like a splinter, a reminder that intent meant nothing without action. He watched her walk away, her back straight despite the years, and felt a quiet resolve take root. Change wasn't a gift he could expect, it was a labor he'd have to prove, day by day, with humility he was only beginning to understand. Far from Montrose. Maya had thrown herself into her next mission, her relentless drive propelling her into a new town, a new fight. But Montrose lingered in her thoughts, a chapter she couldn't quite close. Letters trickled in from the community, handwritten notes and typed updates about reforms taking shape, about the struggles and small victories unfolding in her absence. They were proof that her work had rippled outward, touching lives she'd never meet. She didn't crave praise or plaques, the quiet certainty of progress was enough. One quiet afternoon. As she sat in her sparse office, an email pinged onto her screen. It was from Dan, the subject line blank, the message brief but heavy. "I don't know if you'll read this. But I wanted to say thank you, for pushing me to see what I didn't want to, for giving me a chance to be better. I won't waste it." She stared at the words, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then typed a reply, "Keep going." Simple, direct, a final nudge from a woman who'd never been one for sentiment. Back in Montrose, the town was stitching itself back together. Thread by fragile thread. A new police chief, a stern but fair woman named Elena Torres, had taken the helm, her no-nonsense demeanor a balm to a department in disarray. She held open forums. Her dark eyes scanning the crowd as she listened to grievances and outlined plans for transparency. Trust was a sapling, tender and slow to grow, but it was there. Nurtured by voices that had once been stifled. At one such meeting, Dan rose to speak, his palms sweaty as he gripped the microphone. The room hushed, a sea of eyes, some wary, some hopeful, fixed on him. "I was part of the problem," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I abused my power, and I hurt people I was supposed to protect. I can't erase that, but I can promise to spend every day trying to make it right." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by a soft murmur from Mrs. Carter in the back. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, a crack in the wall of resentment. For Dan, for Montrose, it was a lesson carved in stone: justice demanded accountability. And the misuse of power bore consequences that rippled far beyond the moment. The road to redemption was long, but they were walking it together, one halting, hopeful step at a time. On a crisp autumn evening, beneath the flickering glow of a single street lamp in the town square of Montrose, he stood before a small crowd, his breath visible in the chilly air. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried inside. As he spoke, his words wove a tapestry of his life, a journey marked by stumbles, missteps, and a burning resolve to rise above them. The townsfolk, bundled in coats and scarves, watched him with eyes that flickered between curiosity and distrust. Their faces etched with the lines of a shared, painful history. He didn't plead for their mercy or beg for a clean slate, he knew better than to expect such a gift. Instead, he laid bare his promise. To labor tirelessly, to seek wisdom in his failures, and to push forward, step by faltering step. For the first time, the people of Montrose began to see him not as the shadow of his past self, a figure cloaked in arrogance and misuse of power, but as a man clawing his way toward something better, something worthy. The seasons shifted slowly in Montrose, each passing month painting the town in hues of amber, then frost, then green anew. What had once been a place suffocating under the weight of betrayal and broken trust began to breathe again. His story, once a whispered cautionary tale, grew into something larger. Something alive with resilience and the faint pulse of hope. The transformation wasn't loud or sudden, it unfolded in quiet moments, the creak of a porch swing as neighbors lingered to talk. The soft clatter of dishes in a diner where forgiveness was never spoken but sometimes felt. The scars of yesterday still marred the town's edges, cracked cobblestones, faded storefronts. The hollowed-out shell of an old mill, but they no longer loomed as symbols of despair. Instead, they stood as silent witnesses to what had been endured and overcome. Like weathered tombstones marking a battle won against the darker impulses of human nature. He wasn't alone in this slow rebirth. There was Maya, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Her hands rough from years of mending what others broke. She'd once been his fiercest critic, her voice a blade that cut through his excuses in those early days when he first returned to Montrose. Back then, she'd stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line as she listened to his promises. Inside, she wrestled with a storm of emotions, anger at his past abuses of authority, grief for the trust he'd shattered, and a flicker of something she couldn't name, something dangerously close to hope. Over time, she became more than a bystander. She began to challenge him not with venom, but with questions that forced him to dig deeper. Why should we believe you? What happens when the work gets hard? Her own heart softened, though she'd never admit it aloud, as she saw the sweat on his brow and the sincerity in his faltering steps. Maya's presence grounded the town's fragile renewal, her quiet strength a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about rebuilding what had been torn apart. Then there was Dan. The grizzled mechanic whose oil-stained hands had fixed more than just engines in his lifetime. He'd known the man from before, back when power had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. Someone who'd once turned a blind eye to the town's pleas for fairness. Dan's memory was long, and his trust was hard-won. He'd lingered at the back of that first gathering, his cap pulled low, chewing on a toothpick as he sized up the speaker. Inside, He felt the ache of old wounds, the jobs lost, the promises broken under the man's earlier reign. Yet, as the years crept by, Dan found himself watching from his garage as the man hauled lumber to repair the schoolhouse roof or knelt in the dirt to plant flowers along the town's forgotten streets. Each small act chipped away at Dan's skepticism, though he'd grumble to anyone who'd listen that he wasn't convinced yet. In truth, he was starting to see a flicker of the accountability he'd craved for so long, a lesson in the slow, unglamorous work of making amends. The journey stretched on, far from its end. But Montrose itself became a living testament to something profound. The town square, once a place of hushed resentment, now buzzed with cautious optimism, children chasing each other around the newly painted gazebo, old-timers swapping stories on benches that no longer sagged. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, a business that had reopened after years of darkness, its windows glowing warmly against the dusk. Every corner of Montrose whispered of courage, the courage to face the ugliness of the past, to hold a mirror to one's own flaws, and to demand more from the systems that had failed them all. The man's efforts weren't perfect, there were days he faltered, nights he doubted, but he kept going, driven by a truth he'd learned the hard way: change wasn't a lightning strike. It was a garden tended with calloused hands, watered with persistence, and guarded against the weeds of complacency. This story, though rooted in Montrose, rippled far beyond its borders, touching the lives of anyone willing to listen. It wasn't just about one man's redemption or a town's recovery, it was about all of us. It was about the choices that define us, the structures we either prop up or tear down, and the raw bravery it takes to stare into the abyss of our own mistakes. The lesson was clear: power, when abused, leaves scars that linger for generations, but justice, true justice, demands more than retribution. It calls for the grueling, unglamorous work of repair, of accountability, of transformation. Change didn't come cheap or quick in Montrose, and it never would. But it came because people like him, Maya, and Dan chose to stand up, to speak out, to roll up their sleeves and do what was right, even when it hurt, even when it was hard. Imagine yourself standing in their shoes, the cold wind of Montrose biting at your skin, the weight of their choices pressing against your chest. Would you find the strength to own your failures, to demand better from those who wield power over you, to fight for a world that doesn't just punish but heals? The story of Montrose isn't a neat fairy tale, it's a mirror, reflecting the messy, beautiful, brutal truth of what it means to be human. It's a call to action, a reminder that the consequences of unchecked power can destroy, but the pursuit of justice can rebuild. Share your thoughts below. What would you do in their place? If this tale struck a chord, give it a like and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that provoke, uplift, and linger long after the screen fades to black. Thanks for joining us, we'll see you next time.